After my husband died, Mill insisted that her new husband and she move into my house. I agreed, moved out, and left them with all the bills. 4 months ago, I lost my husband. Even now, as I write this, it's hard to believe. I still feel his presence every day, hoping I'll wake up from this nightmare. He came home from work one day, and after just half an hour, he collapsed suddenly. I called for help, but despite my efforts with CPR, he passed away in my arms within minutes. The ambulance and police arrived, and they took him away for an autopsy because there was no obvious cause of death. I couldn't comprehend why it happened. He was only 33, young and healthy. After everyone left, I was in shock, feeling like I was losing my mind. I called my mother-in-law, who has never liked me since we first met. I've always been polite to her, but she's never included me in family events, not even when my husband was alive. She didn't seem interested in talking to me, and she made a backhanded comment about me being there for my partner during tough times instead of her. I never crossed her boundaries and always tried my best to connect with her, but she never acknowledged my efforts. SIL, my sister-in-law, was just like her mother. She ignored me at family events and even talked over me intentionally. My husband noticed this and tried to address it with her, but she never changed. Neither Mill nor SIL ever asked about my career or life. Mill once called me stuck-up and spoiled because I went to a private school, while she was a public school teacher. Our conversations always revolved around her son. She even tried to talk my husband out of marrying me, suggesting he find someone better. Thankfully, he didn't listen and proposed anyway. When Mill found out, she freaked out and told me to be the best wife for him. I felt offended by her remarks about how she'd taken care of my husband over the years, but I tried not to dwell on it. Even though my husband had informed her of our engagement, she never reached out to congratulate me. She only spoke with him and ignored me completely. Despite our decision to pay for our wedding ourselves, when Mill offered to cover half the cost, we politely declined, which upset her even more. She expressed sadness at feeling unneeded by her son. To compromise, we suggested she organize the rehearsal dinner, which she agreed to. However, things took a turn the night before the wedding when she publicly complained about the stress of the wedding preparations, despite not contributing financially or in planning. We hoped the rehearsal dinner would be better, but it turned out to be a disappointment, with cheap plastic tablecloths on picnic tables. During the wedding, the cold Mexican food added to the off atmosphere as Mill acted upset, making the celebration uncomfortable. She became drunk and behaved inappropriately with other guests, so we had to ask SIL to escort her out. My sister-in-law protested, but my husband stood firm, and they both left. The next day, my husband strongly reprimanded Mill, leading to a huge fight. Since then, both Mill and SIL avoided contact with us. Years passed without speaking to them. When my husband passed away, I had to gather courage to call Mill and inform her. At first, she couldn't believe it, then she started blaming me, yelling that I had killed her son and vowing to make me pay. I didn't expect her to comfort me, but her reaction still shocked me. I also tried to inform SIL, but she didn't answer, so I hoped she'd hear from Mill the next day. A doctor contacted me with the initial autopsy results, revealing that my husband's cause of death was a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot blocking the main pulmonary artery. The doctor explained that even with immediate medical attention, there was no chance of survival. I informed Mill of the results, and she seemed somewhat calmer. We agreed she would come to my house that evening to discuss funeral arrangements. However, when she arrived, she wasn't alone. She had brought the police with her. These were the same officers who had been present the day my husband passed away and had questioned me about his death. Mill began accusing me of murder, claiming I had planned it all. She seemed to believe they would arrest me based on her accusations. I stayed calm and showed the police the copy of the autopsy report I had received earlier. They reviewed it and tried to explain to Mill that her son's death was due to a medical condition, not murder. Despite their efforts, Mill argued that the document could be fake. The officers reassured me and left since there was no crime. Mill remained furious, threatening to put me in prison, but I wasn't concerned because I knew I was innocent. The next issue arose regarding the funeral arrangements. My husband and I had never discussed death much, being young, but I remember him mentioning he wanted to be cremated. Mill, however, insisted on a traditional burial. When Mill learned of my idea, she erupted into yelling once again, accusing me of wanting to dispose of her son's body to destroy evidence against me. SIL, who was nearby, joined in, accusing me of trying to erase evidence and hurt them intentionally. Their cruel words tested my patience, but I stood my ground, suggesting they bury his ashes if they insisted on a burial. Mill threatened to sue me, but I dismissed it, knowing her threats were empty. She even accused me of allowing the hospital to butcher her son during the autopsy. I explained the necessity of the procedure, but SIL accused me of killing him due to marital pressures. I scoffed and explained to her that we were a two-income household without children, so there was no tension between us. I reassured her that whatever happened to him was unexpected and unrelated to any household stress. Despite my explanations, Mill continued to argue over trivial matters during the funeral arrangements, including the music, venue, and guest list. I insisted that anyone who wanted to bid farewell to my husband should be welcome, despite Mill's objections. After the funeral, we met with the lawyer to discuss my husband's will. As the lawyer went through the document, it became evident that everything was left to me. Mill and SIL reacted irrationally, accusing me of killing my husband for financial gain and labeling me a gold digger. Their baseless accusations added to the already overwhelming pain of losing my husband. She seemed to believe that her son would still be alive if he hadn't married me, attributing his death to our life together. I understood her pain as a grieving mother, so despite the tension, I remained patient, realizing her grief was clouding her judgment. However, I couldn't accept being blamed for his death. I reminded her that I loved him too, and that he had left me financially secure out of love, not necessity. I made it clear that I wouldn't tolerate their anger directed at me unfairly. I invited them to reach out once they calmed down and realized the baselessness of their accusations. 2 months passed without any contact from them, which, considering the tumultuous time, was a relief. My parents stayed with me at home for several weeks, providing much-needed support. I was too afraid to spend time alone in the house. Every corner reminded me of my late husband, and I often found myself in tears at night. My dad gently suggested selling the house so I could stay with them temporarily, a suggestion my mom supported out of concern for my well-being. However, I couldn't bear to part with the house, as it felt like my last connection to my husband. Last month, out of nowhere, my Mill called, breaking the silence. Surprisingly, she asked about my well-being and the house. Although caught off guard, I tried to keep the conversation civil and updated her on my situation. I mentioned the ongoing struggle of adjusting to life without my husband and the emotional weight of being surrounded by memories. Then, unexpectedly, my mother-in-law dropped a bombshell. My sister-in-law had gotten married again. I was shocked not to have been invited, but Mill explained that they didn't want to disturb me while I was still grieving. I found it strange that my sister-in-law could remarry so soon. My Mill then dropped another bombshell. She had decided that since SIL didn't have her own place, she had asked SIL and her new husband from her third marriage to move into my house. I was shocked by her demand and struggled to respond. I asked if she was joking, but she insisted she was serious. She explained that since she didn't have space in her own house, she thought it was only fair for them to move in with me. I was overwhelmed by the suddenness of this request and tried to compose myself before responding. I explained that while I was willing to host SIL and her husband for a few days, having them move in permanently felt intrusive and overwhelming. My Mill insisted, pointing out that my husband had left the house to me, and it was now my responsibility to accommodate his sister and her husband as a dutiful daughter-in-law. Despite my efforts to convey my feelings and reservations, my mother-in-law stood firm on her decision, making it clear that her choice was non-negotiable. Her words left me feeling helpless, despite my protests that this was my home. She argued that as a widow living alone, I had the space and resources to accommodate SIL and her husband temporarily. Frustrated and unwilling to engage in a prolonged argument, I was on the verge of telling her that if SIL and her husband ever showed up uninvited, I would call the police. However, a sudden idea sparked in my mind. I realized that living in this house, filled with memories of my husband, would be difficult in the long run. So if SIL and her new husband wanted to live here, they were welcome to do so as long as they paid their own bills. Knowing that Mill wouldn't agree if I told her my plan right then, I kept quiet and agreed to her absurd demand. I called my parents and informed them of my decision, and they assured me of their support. Slowly, I began packing my belongings to move in with my parents, making room for SIL and her husband. In the meantime, I diligently worked on transferring the utility bills to my sister-in-law's name. I contacted each utility provider, informing them of the change in occupancy and inquiring about the necessary steps to update the billing information. I filled out the required forms to ensure that the bills would now be addressed to my sister-in-law. When the day arrived for them to move in, I handed over the keys and explained that, as a wedding present, they now had the entire house to themselves. SIL was thrilled and called my mill in excitement, who seemed pleased that her daughter and her new spouse could live without any disruptions. Watching their joy, it seemed they both believed I had given in to their demands and relinquished my house entirely. Meanwhile, I moved back to my parents' place and have been living with them since. They kept my old room, which feels nostalgic to be back in. I feel much better here than I did in my own house. However, at the end of the month, bills started arriving addressed not to me, but to SIL. Confused and frustrated, SIL called me demanding an explanation. Calmly, I explained to her that since she and her mother wanted to live in my place, they would be responsible for all the bills. Before moving out, I had transferred all the bills to her name, except for the deed of the house. Sila erupted in rage, shouting and expressing her displeasure. She threatened not to pay the bills, but I remained unfazed. I reminded her that if she didn't pay on time, she would have to deal with fines in her name. This only angered her more, and she continued to yell, while I maintained a smile of satisfaction. Shortly after, my mother-in-law called, yelling at me for daring to charge her daughter for bills. She claimed that SIL and her husband couldn't afford it, and I should pay out of kindness. I firmly refused, and after some arguing, she announced that SIL and her husband were planning to move out because they couldn't afford the utilities. I welcomed the idea of having my house back. My mill accused me of being heartless and prioritizing money over family, but I remained silent as she hung up in anger. The situation had reversed, and I felt relieved at the thought of regaining control of my home. The plan my mill concocted to inconvenience me had unexpectedly backfired, leaving both her and SIL at a loss. While I felt a sense of satisfaction for standing my ground and revealing the hypocrisy of their demands, I couldn't shake off a lingering feeling of guilt. Here on Reddit, I find myself pondering whether my actions have painted me in a negative light. I'm grateful for the support from everyone who has shared their experiences with loss, offering solace in knowing I'm not alone. Many have asked why I allowed SIL and her husband to move in initially. The truth is, my mill is not easy to argue with. She's incredibly narcissistic and determined to get her way. I also sensed her eyeing the house ever since the lawyer revealed it was left to me. SIL, in turn, is merely a pawn in her mother's schemes, obedient to her every whim. When I moved out, they likely saw it as a green light to claim the house, not expecting any repercussions. Now that SIL and her husband have moved out, she's pleaded with me to pay the outstanding bills, claiming she has no money to cover them. Reluctantly, I've agreed to settle the bills for last month to clear her dues. After that, I'll transfer the utilities back to my name, now that she won't be residing in the house. It seems SIL has learned a valuable lesson. In an update, I can share that since my last post, SIL moved out of my house in frustration upon realizing the bills were under her name. Once I confirmed that SIL had genuinely moved out, I settled her dues and promptly changed all the locks in the house. For the time being, I continued living with my parents. 2 days ago, Mill reached out to my parents to complain about my behavior, escalating the situation further. Despite her attempts to justify her actions, my mother calmly reminded her that I needed to prioritize my own well-being and encouraged SIL and her husband to stand on their own feet rather than depending on me. My mother's firm stance surprised Mill, who attempted to downplay the situation. However, my mother stood her ground, warning Mill against any further threats or harassment, threatening legal action if necessary. Witnessing my mother defend me was empowering, revealing Mill's true nature as a bully who imposed unrealistic expectations on others. Since then, both Mill and SIL have kept their distance, which I hope continues. I'm also considering selling my house to start fresh in a new place where my in-laws can't intrude on my peace again. In a subsequent update, it's been 3 months since my last update, and I've finally listed my house for sale. Although it's been emotionally challenging to let go of a place filled with memories, it also marks a step toward a new beginning. Seeking therapy has been instrumental in navigating through my emotions and coping with grief. While some days are tougher than others, having a supportive network of friends and family has made a significant difference. Each day, I'm learning more about myself and finding strength to move forward.